So good afternoon, everyone. Everyone in the room present in the wonderful Portcullis House and online joining us today. You are very welcome. So I'm Sharon Hodgson, MP for Washington and Sunderland West and chair of the All-Party Group on Dyslexia and Specific Learning Difficulties. Joined by some amazing people. If I just point out the parliamentarians in the room, we've got Lord Dominic Addington. Addington. Oh yeah.
Dyslexia is catchy.
Addington, vice chair, and Tom Hunt, who is a vice chair as well. So Tom's an MP and Dominic's in the Lords. And do people in the room feel the need to introduce themselves, or should we just crack on? Right, we'll crack on. Yeah, we're up to 42 online now, so thank you so much for all joining us. So we've got three excellent speakers today, and they're going to present their thoughts on our current exam-based system of assessment, which you know as GCSE exams. Today's topic has been actually rumbling on for a number of years and was raised particularly during and in the aftermath of the pandemic, when we saw teacher assessed grades used, and it has been in the national news again last week with the announcement that a second private school, Latimer Upper School, will be scrapping their GCSEs from 2027. So today we will discuss whether there's evidence to support rethinking our approach to find alternative ways that students could be assessed beyond our traditional examination approach that will better meet the needs of all learners and those of their future employers. So this is going to be blue sky thinking at its best, I think, today. So our speakers, their full biographies are available on the BDA's website, but in brief today I'll introduce them. So we've got Bill Lucas, who's the director of the Centre for Real World Learning and Professor of Learning at the University of Winchester. He's joining us online, as is Kath Lowther, who's Parliamentary Vice Chair of the Special Educational Consortium, SEC, a group of 40 organisations in the SEND sector, including education unions, charities and parent carer groups. And she's also General Secretary of the Association of Educational Psychologists. And in the room with us today is Anna Marie Hassel, who is Chief Executive of the National Association for Special Educational Needs, NASN, the leading membership charity that exists to champion, connect and support those working in the education community. So first though, I would just turn to the other officers present. We've got Dominic and Tom, just to see if they've got any opening remarks. And then once we've heard from our speakers, we will have a discussion panel that will exist of the parliamentarians and the speakers and the CEO of the BDA, Siobhan Preston, to comment also. So as a reminder, we've requested questions in advance, so I've got a few of those, 4 of those, and we do welcome comments and feedback on this session, but unfortunately we won't be taking live questions from the chat because time will be against us and we won't be able to do that. So any opening remarks from Dominic or Tom on this issue?
I don't, you know, this isn't actually a particular area I've got a huge amount of knowledge on. I've got other views that go to sort of the way Ofsted assesses schools, making sure that there's a premium on being good descended, etc., and diagnosis with different sort of issues. But I think that, so ultimately I'm here to listen to different perspectives as much as possible. However, I think clearly, I've seen there's evidence in my own constituency about GCSEs not being the method of assessment for young people with complex needs. I think at the end of the day, we've got a qualification system that is largely geared towards non-neurodiverse. What we know about neurodiverse is that they process neurodiverse individuals process information differently. I'm pro flexibility in the education system, whatever element of the education system that is, what works for that specific individual. So I come at this with an open mind.
Excellent, thanks Tom. Dominic?
Well, really, this is one of the areas where historically, I'm afraid I am mainly historical, is a case of the way you come in, because these are the gateway examinations to everything else that happens, and particularly English for dyslexics. It's a case of if you fail here, the rest of your education is stuffed. And it's the ways around that and ways around that system, and the fact that we tend to have standards and let's improve spelling tends to be a real block to people progressing in neurodiverse communities. Now, I'm just saying that anything around there, I mean, flexibility, yes, but the reason why I think you need more flexibility, or making sure that systems understand that occasionally a person just won't be able to do X, is actually vitally important to actually how it functions. New types of assessment, I'm all ears, and flexibility will be helpful there. But it's the ability to understand that it's a bit like saying you're in a wheelchair, but you fail because you haven't completed the cross-country course. You know, what are we actually doing to allow people to progress from? I'm afraid having to pass certain GCSEs in certain orders and certain times has actually been disastrous in this case.
Thank you. I should also state for the record as well, we've got apologies from Lord Young and Henry Smith MP. So, and sadly they weren't able to be with us today. So first of all, we are going to start with Professor Bill Lucas from Rethinking Assessment. So Bill, over to you. I believe you have a presentation as well for us.
Thank you very much. I'll just get that up and tell me whether you can see that.
Yes.
Visible? Splendid. Okay, well, I really appreciate being invited to this. Just by way of throat clearing, I'm not an expert in dyslexia or in special learning needs, but I am an expert in learning and I am an expert in assessment. So your opening remarks are going to be of a more general kind, but I'm hoping that all of you who care so understandably and passionately about the full range of learners' abilities and skills will be able to extract something from this. As you said kindly, I'm from Rethink Assessment. I'm here at the University of Winchester, and I also advise a charity called the Commono Foundation, and we have a warm relationship with NASN, and I'm looking forward to what Anna Maria will say. So I'm focusing on secondary, and I've already got two questions, and that's what you've asked me to do. The first is, what knowledge and skills are the kinds of things we want to be cultivating in young people today? And the second of those questions related to it, obviously, is, and how best can we evaluate their progress in those? And that's where I'm going to take you. I wonder sometimes whether we've rather lost sight of the original meaning of the word assessment. Assessment seems to be sitting on high and judging someone, as opposed to its original Latin derivation, which means to sit beside, which has more of a coaching sense to it. And any of my colleagues in special needs would understand the importance of that, as indeed in any good learning, as in professional learning and in professional development of the highest kind in the companies and not-for-profit organisations in the UK. There have been many significant reports, and I go back to a review in the States in 2015. No, I don't. This is one in Wales. The next one is same year in the United States, which have looked at how, given technology, given the emergence of new curricula, how best we might be testing and examining young people's progress. Here's one in the middle now, 2020 from Australia. I'll come back to this one because it recommended a very different way of marking the transition from the end of school to your next step, whether it's college or university or apprenticeship or work or whatever. Another one, a couple of reports actually from Australia. I'm going to come back to Australia, just north of our own border. The recent excellent report by my colleague Louise Hayward, looking at qualifications and assessment in Scotland, and there have been various reviews here in England, and my own overview of promising practices from across the world, on which I'll be drawing in a second. So if we just stand back from the English secondary curriculum for a second and ask ourselves the question, what kind of things do we think young people should be learning? You may be surprised that the answer we get is a slightly different one from the school timetables of young people in secondary education in England. From an overview of the kinds of capabilities or skills, wider skills, dispositions, some would call it, you'll see there's a wide degree of agreement about the kind of things that we'd like young people to be good at. And they include things like, if I just look at the last two columns, perseverance, resilience to adversity, tolerance of diverse opinions, problem solving, metacognition, critical thinking, creativity, and so forth. And you won't see those on the timetable of a school. And you won't see them on the timetable of school for a very good reason. One, we don't value them enough. And two, that's not the way they operate. They operate within subjects. They operate across the curriculum. They're not an alternative to knowledge. They're the way you bring your knowledge and skill alive. Now, don't take my word for it. If you look at the august body, the World Economic Forum, in its deliberation about what might form the basis of a secondary curriculum today, a contemporary curriculum, you'll see some of those wider skills on the left-hand side: critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration. And we've heard perhaps the word oracy in the news recently rather than communication, but same kind of thing. And then at the top, both of these models have it. The kind of subjects that you would expect to see on a school curriculum, if you like, the foundational literacies or necessary knowledge, what it is to be a civilized, well-educated individual. And on the right, and this is very important to the learners for whom many of the organizations on this call are critically important, all those other things about developing character, developing esteem, developing the ability to be a good learner and a good person. And the model on the right, very similar, comes from the Centre for Curriculum Redesign in the States. So we've got a global sense of what we might be doing. So are we doing it? Is England an outlier, or are we in the flow here? Well, actually, we are a bit of an outlier, but these things are beginning to be done. And you can see in some recent research from the Brookings Institution how these kinds of terms are beginning to find their way into secondary curricula. You'll also see that when it comes to pedagogy, that's to say how you teach it, and assessment, the other part of this call today, how you evaluate it, there's not a lot of central guidance. So can it be done? Can it be done in England? Well, just down the road from you in Portcullis House, south of the river, is Thomas Tallis School that's been using our model, the Centre for Real World Learning model of creativity for nearly a decade. And here you can see how they can indeed do this and do this. And a blown up version of it shows how some of the key words that they use to describe the creativity they want to encourage in their young people, some of the techniques that they're focusing on, some of the pedagogy that they're using. And in the very center of this, if you like, dartboard or bullseye, some key words that we want students and teachers and employers and young people to be confident in using. And part of this is culture and language. And interestingly, just to take a very brief side alley, the Arts Council, in its work for the Durham Commission, has developed definitions for the kind of things I'm talking about. And this is important because unless we can define these other things, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to teach it rigorously and then to evaluate it. And just one step more, PISA, that testing organization best known for English and or literacy and numeracy and science, is also very interested in what I've just been talking about. I'm chair of the most recent PISA test in 2022, and we'll publish these results in 24 in spring. And these were 15-year-olds, so these are the very 15-year-olds that sit in the center of the secondary schools that we're talking about. Sadly, England did not opt into this test, but that's a subject for another APPG. I have made my case there. So why, if this is the broad emerging consensus for the kind of secondary curriculum that we might want, why might we argue, I certainly will, our assessment system isn't quite fit for purpose yet? Well, 4 reasons. It's far too shallow, too narrow, set on, if you leave the joy of geography to try and get into history, the bell goes. If you want to move out of one subject to another, it tends to be very difficult, certainly, to find any place in which it might be examined. Our methods are pretty blunt. I mean, who would have thought that in 2023, the best way of discovering young people's ability to understand scientific concepts and apply them was to stick them in a gymnasium and sit them at a chair and table that they didn't particularly understand. It's very small, rather dusty and smelly, and answer a 2-hour paper and pencil exam? I think not. And it was Ofqual in 2020 in response to the Education Select Committee that reminded us that grades are only reliable to one grade either way at GCSE and A-level. Well, if you, like me, are the parents of young people who've just left the formal education system, that's a worry. A B might be a C or might be an A, and that might be the difference between success in a next destination and not. And there's a growing literature, and Sarah Jane Blakemore in the organisation Rethinking Assessment, it's a very well-known psychologist from Cambridge, has shown how in many cases the teenage brain is simply not ready for the kind of tests we're giving it. And here Daniel Koretz, in a coruscating and rather unsettling review of testing, describing the physical effects of some of these tests. And I'm guessing that the young people that the organisations around these virtual tables represent will know what I'm talking about here. But here's just a longer list of the ways in which it's not working. But don't worry, I'm an optimist and someone keen to suggest solutions rather than suggest what we might not do. We can talk about both when we get to the debate. And there's just a list of things that you might like just to hold in the back of your mind about why what we're doing is not terribly effective. So let me now take you on a quick tour of the world for the next 4 or 5 minutes, something like that, and just give you a hint of some of the ways in which we might choose to be assessing more interestingly, relevantly, deeply, kindly, the things that we want to see young people developing. So here at a glance are the kind of things I'm talking about. And I'm going to just walk you through each of them, starting with psychometric tests and ending with the large tile there, profiling, because I think that is the way we need to go. Profiling and portfolios, both really critical ways of gathering this kind of evidence. Well, psychologists working with children and indeed adults have often drawn on psychometric tests. Teachers could do the same. I'm not saying we need to draw on them for a summative assessment, but they may be very useful pointers to us as to how young people are progressing. It's a very well-known one here, Angela Duckworth's grit scale, but there are lots of others. Carol Dweck's growth mindset assessment is a really useful one, and you can see the kind of words that are coming through there. And they are about curiosity, about perseverance, about self-regulation. The fancy academic word for this is metacognition, and there are some really good ways of charting the improvement of metacognition. Our own Education Endowment Foundation a few years ago produced something very helpful for teachers on this topic. The much maligned SMART, or rather the much maligned multiple choice test, is becoming smarter. It's becoming smarter when you use images as well as words and numbers, and it's becoming smarter because you can do it online as well. A particularly effective one, two particularly effective ones are the one that abbreviates to PARC, and this is in the States, a test of readiness for college and careers after secondary, and the mission skills assessment, which is a lovely inventory of the kind of things that might help us flourish during our lifetime. The test that I referred to earlier on, the PISA Creative Thinking 2022 test, had an earlier iteration in 2015 of a collaborative problem-solving test. Now, isn't it fascinating that assessment in schools is a solo pursuit? It's a heroic pursuit. Look at us. We're sitting round virtual tables. We're a group. Most of what I do that is meaningful in life is collaborative. It involves other people. Employers want young people, as they leave university or college, to be able to work in teams. We want people who can work effectively with others and solve problems together. So it's funny, isn't it, that some of these things are just simply absent in secondary schools, but they need not be. I'll tell you more about that in a second. Well, here's something we could be doing and are doing right now. The extended project qualification is taken by about 30,000 young people every year out of a cohort of 600,000. It's an A-level, it counts for an A-level. It counts actually in terms of UCAS tariff points for half of an A-level. And EPQ, or extended project qualification, has a smart sister called HPQ, or higher project qualification, half the value of a GCSE. So there's absolutely nothing to stop a school that really cares about this, a secondary school, an ordinary secondary school, saying we're going to offer some HPQ opportunities. And those could be interdisciplinary, they could be subjects or qualifications or opportunities that are developed by the school itself. We may come back to the news that the chair mentioned earlier on about some innovation in the GCSE space later on. Of course, you can bring things right down. Think scouts, think guides, think badges, and then think digital. We can bring the kind of things that we're doing right down to what are called micro-credentials. I think in another 5 years, these will be common in schools, so that you won't have to wait until you've completed 2 years of a GCSE or BTEC examination. You can get your results rather earlier, because you can badge an aspect of what you're doing. And that can be, of course, digitally collected up. I'll come on to this when we talk about profiles. The way of beginning to gather these together is, I think, portfolios. And whether you're using it to showcase your best work, as a place to put your work in progress, or in a more formal way for assessment, or probably as a hybrid for all three of these, it's very important. The Independent Commission on Assessment in Primary Education, of which I was proud to be a commissioner, we've made an explicit recommendation that this should be part of the primary experience as a great transition tool for children coming out of primary and going into secondary. A great way of communicating better what needs to be done. Now, of course, if you were a Martian looking at our system, you'd say, what on earth are you doing? Why don't you treat this whole business more like a driving test? So you give a theoretical and a practical test to somebody when they're ready, or more like a music exam. Similarly, a test when you're ready, a graded test, so nothing not rigorous about it, and with components. You can't let them just do the things they've rehearsed. You want to see what they're like when they're trying to do something unseen, and you need to get at the grammar of it, so the scales and arpeggios too. There's nothing flaky about this. This is rigorous, and as we know from COVID and now many universities across the world, especially in medicine and engineering, very high status higher education institutions doing this as of natural course. And very interestingly, in the secondary space, Voice 21 showing how you can assess the development of oracy. You can even be playful about this. Here's an example from Georgia and primary education, and here's an example from the assessment of critical and creative thinking in the state of Victoria in Australia, where I've been working, not recently, sadly. And these are online experiences that are so fun that the state had to quarantine them because the children were enjoying doing their assessment too much. Heaven forfend. The future, colleagues, of what I'm talking about is multimodal. Simply assuming that one kind of paper and pencil test is the answer is silly. We need to have a much broader variety of tests. Not too many, because that would be stressful for kids and impossible for teachers. But we need to get at what the young person thinks is going on. We need to have a really rigorous progression of what skill progression looks like, and we need to bring it together in some kind of portfolio. We've recently had a go at this, even within the English curriculum, with our colleagues, ACR, the Australian Council for Educational Research, in secondary schools, trying out to see whether it's possible to embed creative thinking in English, history, science, design and technology, and art and design. And the answer is it is. And you can weave this through the subject, and you can assess it in ways that you hadn't previously been taught how to do. Here's an example of a progression in just one of those, the capacity to be imaginative, looking at how that progress might look. Nearly there. Bringing all this to a close, the International Baccalaureate has long argued that the IB needs to be not just about knowledge, but about these kind of things like inquiring, risk-taking, being able to be a good reflector, etc., and bringing them together in a profile. But the IB's profile is a statement of intent, not an actual profile. There are now profiles being developed across the world. We're part of that movement. Here's one from Australia. Here's one in the States being widely used. Just going back to the one in Australia, by the way, this is now accepted by half of the higher education institutions in Australia as part of the transition, not an alternative to our A levels. They don't have A levels, they have an ATAR score, but as a complement to. And here's the Mastery Transcript Consortium being used in the States and in 1 or 2 questions here. Another Australian example. Now, our own example, rethinking assessment, this is now being prototyped right across Doncaster Education Authority, right across Hertfordshire, and in some schools up and down the land, including alternative provision and special education colleagues. Our belief is that if you can gather together a strength-based assessment, a view of what young people can do, you're much more likely to teach them better, motivate them better. And my goodness me, motivation and attendance is one of our biggest challenges in the school system at the moment. And you can see how that little creative thinking area I was exploring would sit in the top left-hand corner. Me as a learner is all about how I get better as a learner. And then I've got a chance to, as it were, curate all these other things I can do. Not just me saying this, here's a recommendation in Australia where it's now national policy. So I'm hardly an outlier here. And here's the wonderful commission that Rachel Sylvester led, making a central plank of their recommendations that all students should end up with a digital learner profile. Thank you so much for listening. Really looking forward to taking part in the rest of this discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bill. That lots of food for thought. When you were mentioning PISA, immediately Finland flashed into my head, and I haven't checked lately, but I think they always top PISA on the scales, on the league tables. They used to. I don't know if they still do, but I don't think they have any assessment, formal assessment at all until age 18, if I'm right in thinking.
Finland's an interesting case. They were right up there. They're slightly less right up there, but still doing remarkably well. They start school later. Much of the curriculum and much of the assessment is school or locality based. So you're absolutely right. It's a more complex picture, but I hope you felt I'm really keen we avoid any crude binary alternatives in this. I think there are some really subtle ways through this that have a great evidence base.
Thank you. I look forward to exploring that more during our panel discussion. So thank you, Bill. We're now going to hear from Anna-Marie Hassel from Mason, who's with us in the room.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and particularly to Siobhan Preston for including me in the debate and discussion here today. So I'm here from NASON, the National Association for Special Educational Needs, a long-standing membership organisation that draws its membership from schools, from colleges, and from those with a passion about education. So I'm going to make 3 specific points here, and one is to talk about the context. So why now? Why is now the absolute optimum time to make change for assessment, and in particular about what happens at age 16? And secondly, to talk about a principle called inclusion by design, which is, say, low cost, no cost, philosophical approach. And thirdly, to talk about some practical examples that could really make change and transform what's happening at the moment in education. So I'll keep it quite simple. I have to say that I agree with the presentation and the points made by Bill. So from a philosophical point, I think that's absolutely spot on. I need to say that the Department for Education has been investing in those across education, in supporting inclusion in schools, in supporting and identifying special educational needs for a number of years. We're going in the right direction. It's just the pace isn't quite there. So the risk that we have is that we have a whole generation of children who don't get the education that they deserve. Specifically, since 2014, the Children and Families Act set a policy direction for inclusion. We really are talking here about the majority of schools in England. So the majority of schools opening their doors and putting real effort into the inclusive. Now, I'm not leaving out the independent sector or specialists, but I want to really focus here the argument on what we're doing in the mainstream education, because it's where most of the children in England are currently. Now, the numbers of children with identified needs have been increasing year on year. We've been collecting data in a similar way, 2015 and beyond, and we can see the numbers are continuing. They continue to rise as predicted, then by 2025, around 20% of the children in education are likely to have an identified need. So it's a special educational need. It doesn't necessarily mean an education, health and care plan. So increasing numbers. Now, why is that happening? It's happening because our education system is improving in identifying at an earlier stage that children have additionality, that have needs that require support for them to have the best education possible. So in England, around 23,000 schools are working hard to be more inclusive than they were previously. That's a lot of schools and a lot of people, and around 17,000 of those schools are currently connecting, engaging with information and with training programs offered by NASON and funded by the Department for Education. So there is investment going in to ensure that teachers have access to tools and resources that they need. That increasing population in mainstream education, if we look at what's happening in secondary phase, children go into secondary school and they have their sight line for their future, their ambition, their trajectory, and they're all looking at mainly GCSE opportunities. That increasing population of children with additional needs, some of whom will have dyslexia, so those children are all following a similar pathway. So if we draw this in a mathematical sense, like a bell curve, we're really aiming the offer in schools at the children who are sitting in the middle of the bell curve. And we're not including those that are on the outliers, those that are on the extremities of that bell curve. And the more that we include, the narrower that cohort becomes sitting in the middle of the bell curve. So it really is a critical point. We've got the success, the efforts of schools, the benefit of training and early identification. But if we don't change and amend the assessment system and significantly what's happening at GCSE, then we have a whole cohort of children and young people who don't feel that they belong. So the school is changing mindset. The school is addressing the curriculum. The school is seeking support. They would argue not enough support is there, but this is about the assessment. They're successfully including, but they can't offer a route, a successful route for the children. And an unintended consequence, multi-academy trust leaders, head teachers are quietly saying, I might have to cap inclusion because the lack of success for their school at GCSE level, and this isn't individual success, this is, when we're comparing school results with another, that is proving then to be a disincentive to inclusion. So on one hand, we are really driving a hugely successful inclusion policy, and on the other, we're not making the adjustments to be able to demonstrate the success of each and every learner in the mainstream school system. So that essentially is the primary reason why we absolutely have to make change. At Key Stage 4 at GCSE level, that's absolutely paramount. We've been working with schools since 2018, and they've been developing an approach that we refer to as whole school. So it's a whole school approach, end to end, where they are thinking about the design, the environment, the way that they offer curriculum, the way that they include. And that approach has been really inspired by the investment of the Department for Education. I say, of course, there's never enough funding, but we have to recognise that there has been investment in training, but training is not the only solution. If we look at what could be the practical solutions, around GCSE and assessment. We can look at examples, and I have to say this will be in the independent sector. So it's the independent sector who have pushed the boundaries and considered alternative opportunities, alternative routes, alternative pathways and ways of measuring progress. I know of a small number of schools who are testing out approaches described by Professor Bill Lucas. So the extended project qualification at GCSE level, and they are making that offer for the whole school population. They're not othering the cohort of children and young people who bring additional needs. They're not othering SEND pupils. They're saying this is an opportunity for all, because all children and young people engage with exam systems and assessment in a different way. We don't have a discrete group of learners who flourish with an exam system. So some schools are experimenting, but it's almost below the radar, because the official way of comparing one school with another is through using the GCSE system. And so we have got examples around the country. We have got schools that are really testing the way. We have got school leaders who, despite feeling overworked, under-resourced, are finding ways of including children and young people. And we need to be able to open this up to let the sector step forward and share the examples that they have, to share the practice that really is making a difference, and to select some that we can test out nationally, with a view that then we can have some alternative measures, some alternative approaches that can be effective and demonstrate progress in mainstream. An example could certainly be any one of the portfolios set out here by Professor Bill Lucas, but I can say that there is an appetite for this among school leaders. This would not be sort of top down, coming from government policy direction. This would be asking practitioners. And as evidence, I can say that in July, we had our annual NASON Live conference, and I asked the question. We put up a Slido, you know, one of those fancy polls, so you can see exactly how many people in the room think something at the same time, and 95% said that they would be interested in accessing, if it was free for them to access, they didn't have to pay something commercial, that they would be interested in accessing learner profiles, digital learner profiles online. They would be interested in having something that could work for all learners, that could include those with SEND, as well as be available for the mainstream. So there's appetite. Children and young people with dyslexic are not always recognised for having potential that can be exceed their chronological age. And quite often there'll be examples of a young person who will excel in one or more subjects. However, because they are being supported for their SEND needs, they don't necessarily get the opportunity. I say don't necessarily, because there are examples of schools doing something different. They don't routinely get an opportunity to have an accelerated progress in a particular subject, not within our mainstream education. So yesterday, a really helpful organisation, Potential Plus UK, undertook a Facebook poll, and they asked parents where their children had additional needs, how many were actually receiving opportunities for accelerated progress, because we're not talking about children as a deficit, we're talking about children as unique individuals who will develop different ways, different times. We've got a system that tests them all at a chronological age, for most at age 16. And what we know is that some children can respond particularly well to earlier opportunities to accelerate their learning in an area where they've got a particular level of interest. And yes, continue to support their access to education by supporting the area of special educational needs. Doesn't mean that all subjects, that all areas of their development will require the same level of support. So we have two complicated factors here. One, the same system for the majority of children that suits those in the middle. And secondly, that we are offering GCSEs predominantly at a particular chronological age and not accepting that some children could really be motivated and accelerate if offered opportunities at a different stage. And that could be younger if they're ready, and that could actually extend right the way through their entitlement to education, right up to age 25. They're age 25 and achieving their first GCSE, that could be the measure of success. So to conclude, we talk about inclusion by design at NASA, and that really is the principle, is to think about the environment, think about the classroom, think about how education is delivered and planned. And we think about those children and young people who would be the outliers, those that could be accelerated, those that need additional support. We make sure that the system works for them. It means we're not leaving anybody out in the middle. But if we include those who are currently often the outliers, if we give them an opportunity of success and pride and an annual celebration day, it doesn't all have to be in order for an annual celebration day, then we include all children and we're designing them in. It's underpinned by the current legislation. Equality Act essentially is a very reasonable adjustment to make if we address what's happening at age 16.
I've actually got that fairly soon,
Yeah.
so I'm not going to be able to. So I appreciate that. I'm just interjecting, but I just wanted to make a comment. Is that okay?
That's fine. And I was just going to thank Anna Marie for a presentation that
Thank
it
you.
really spoke to me, but
Yeah.
you go ahead.
I guess I really sort of value what I've heard today, and I think it is vitally important that we have flexibility and we have, when it comes to assessment, we think about the neurodiverse individuals and what works for them. But and I think what you did touch on there, the fact that no person is the same, and we shouldn't other, because my experience has been that I had dyslexic, kind of dyspraxic, but I actually quite like traditional methods of assessment. So I remember when I was at university, I was in politics and modern history, and there was all these different courses that looked really interesting. But then all the assessment methods were, I remember there was a sort of a group poster and these other things. So I ended up not doing those courses, and I ended up doing Spanish history because it was the only one of traditional exams. And then I did a master's, which was 75% exam, which is very unusual for a master's. So I weirdly, even as a dyslexic and dyspraxic, I was very traditional. I mean, I like this sort of traditional exam. So I think it really is. When I meet dyslexic, fellow dyslexics, fellow dyspraxics, no one is the same in terms of the assessment method that they like. Many hate exams. I liked exams, and I didn't like coursework because I felt being coursework almost reminded me of being more organised. I'm disorganised. That's probably more of a dyspraxic element. Whereas sort of the exams, I could wing it. I could rewrite things, push it into the bit of the brain where I can retain the information. So. But I think the key thing here, as you say, is flexibility, and it goes across neurodiverse and non-neurodiverse. And it's about having an assessment method that allows that individual to thrive and show the best of themselves. But I do think it's important though that there shouldn't be any assumptions made about neurodiverse individuals and what, because some may like exams, some may not like exams.
So how long have you got before you've got to run, Tom?
Do
Do you want to quickly?
I would say you're absolutely spot on. You know, say modality is everything. The ability to flex and to say that the right approach for a particular learner could be an exam. It could be an exam, but taken in exam conditions over 2 or 3 sessions rather than all in one go. And some exam boards, I'm fearful of naming them because they do some of this quietly, but AQA have done this specifically to support dyslexic students. And there are current flexibilities that work and are enabling some young people to absolutely to thrive and show and flourish.
And I did always get extra time.
Yeah.
So I liked exams, but I did always get extra time.
Yeah. But sometimes the extra time in one go doesn't quite do it,
Yeah.
because if there's, if recall is a challenge, then just having an extra 30 minutes is just going to be,
Yeah.
just longer staring at the same piece of paper, whereas an opportunity to have that spread over maybe 2 sessions could
Yeah.
actually make a significant difference. And if we can say that that level of flexibility could enlighten what's happening currently in the school system, we could make a huge difference for children and young people. So I'm not saying eliminate GCSEs, I'm saying we need modality, we need flexibility, and we need some alternatives that could be there for all children and young people, because we can't make assumptions. Many aren't necessarily identified with particular needs until they struggle at that real test, that terminal exam test.
I'm really sorry I can't today.
Oh.
I'm really disappointed I can't.
Oh.
So I'm
Yeah.
just waiting.
Will there be a recording that Tom
Yes.
will be able to access to? Yes. So you'll be able to catch up with our last
The-
speaker and with the conversation that will flow.
It's possible to ask another question along that vein right now. Sorry for
Yes.
delay. Saying,
Thanks,
but-
Tom.
historically, what actually happened, a lot of flexibility was lost when we went down to smaller number of boards. If we're going back to the dark ages, which is definitely my educational career, there were lots of exam boards offering the options at O-level and the old CSE exams, and you could pick your way through. And these were only things about accessing, not the first sort of assessment of the examining, going through the old written exam, but you could dictate it, somebody give you extra time, blah, 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 blah. Does there need to be a fundamental change within government that this type of, one size fits all assessment really doesn't work for a huge number, which is leading to a high number of failure? And is that something which the likes of myself and Sharon and Tom should be taking back to say, you are guaranteeing a higher number of failure without this?
And
Because it's nothing to do with what you're teaching. It's just saying, if you can't pass the exam, you're regarded as a failure. End of story. And it doesn't matter what you've learned. Is that be a fundamental point?
that is, I think, a very strong point. That is, well, you framed it excellently, because it's not just about the recital of information in a particular format. We're not actually having regard for, some children have had support through school with technology, with assistive technology. When they get to the exam situation, they're not permitted to have that.
I'm very glad I wasn't the first person to mention it.
But they're not permitted to have that flexibility.
So basically we've got, even if you're only going to go to an exam, and I think they're actually, I don't know what Sharon thinks about this, but I think there is still a cultural shift away from the exam being the norm. And I don't think we're there yet. There has to be a thing of saying, I went through this 10 years ago with the apprenticeships. By the way, just because it's a computer doesn't just say they'll instantly be cheating. Like that. That was the English test for the on the apprenticeship. But actually, it was, that was an incredibly difficult step to come over. But I think it is certainly a message that we should be carrying out, saying there are other ways of assessing what you're doing, even if it's still based on a written paper. Just wondering, is there anybody who disagrees with this approach as an intermediate step, at least?
I don't think you would meet barriers. I think there would be organisational complexities, but that should be possible to overcome. And schools do find it such a challenge that they have been encouraged to develop skills and knowledge around assistive tech in the classroom, but when we get to the exam situation, that isn't permissible, that's not possible. And they have demonstrated how they have managed blended learning, some children engaging remotely, but yet when it comes to the exam system, that's not possible. But in the workplace, we then expect these young adults to become conversant with technology within the workplace. And in fact, any employer would be highly criticised for not making the right level of adjustment to include that adult in the workplace.
Right, thank you. So we had a little segue there into questions, but we we'll get plenty of time to hear from Bill and Kath in questions later also. But that now brings me to Kath Lowther for her to give us her presentation on behalf of the Special Educational Consortium. Kath.
Hi, thank you. So I'm Dr. Kath Lowther, and what was missing from my biography is I'm also a qualified educational psychologist. So very recently, this time last year, I was working in a local authority as an educational psychologist. So some of that background is going to come into this kind of presentation. But I am here representing the Special Educational Needs Consortium, which is called SEC. Like Nathan, it is a membership organisation. There's 40 members, and we're there to protect and promote the rights of children and young people who are disabled and who have special educational needs. And primarily we work on sharing consensus positions throughout all those 40 members. So if something has a stamp of SEC on it, it means that 40 members have agreed. And so we think that is a particular strength for the organisation. And we have, responded to various consultations for the department. We've presented evidence to select committees, to all party parliamentary groups, etc. And so I think we are quite well known and respected in that form. In terms of reforming assessment, this is not something that we have talked about greatly. So there are very few points that I can share today around the consensus position of SEC. So these are the 3 points: the idea of making sure that reasonable adjustments are made. So I think Anna-Marie was alluding to that in terms of having additional time, having space over the day, perhaps using digital technologies that you are ordinarily using within the class, but really recognising that the Equality Act should apply at assessment level and at schooling level as well, of course. We also agree that qualifications should be purposeful. There should be a reason for the qualification, not just as a stepping stone into the next stage, but also around what is important for that young person. So, for example, building confidence and self-esteem, but of course, Bill also listed all the other really important factors that education brings for children, young people growing up and preparing for adulthood. And flexibility is a word that you have all used and talked about, that being really important at all age levels for assessment, from very small children at the early years foundation stage, but all the way up to for the GCSE level going into post-16, and really thinking about how the assessments come in at the right time, and because either as Anna-Marie was saying, people might accelerate and do things more quickly, but also some other children with special educational needs may need more time to attain the levels that they are capable of. So those are the 3 points that we would ask and be considered and remembered within assessment. I think there's been a lot of kind of conversation already around exams and where to go. I think we know that exams are not particularly helpful for many young people. Some, yes, absolutely love the exam idea of kind of, that's one shot, high stakes, get it out the way, put everything in that basket, and then we're done. So there are certainly some children and young people who benefit from exams, but there are a vast majority of children and young people who find exams particularly excruciating. So there's a quote from Bill in terms of the kind of nausea and physically sick kind of sense of impact on mental health, the level of anxiety. But there are so many percentage-wise of young people and children who are viewing exams and the high stakes element of particularly GCSEs, that idea of all or nothing. You get your GCSE and that's the end of it, or not, and that's the end of the rest of your life idea. And that impacting very much on how children and young people view education and how they view exams as well, and assessments. So that sort of very negative view really impacting on children and young people's mental health and having a real impact. And we know that from in terms of thinking about the wider school context, that mental health picture is exacerbating and getting worse. So there's definitely something related to the pandemic and the lockdowns in terms of shifts. And I know that potentially is bringing up the question around how can we look at assessment differently when we had teacher-based assessments for GCSEs. So by the by, my son was one of those 2020 GCSE young persons. So he had his GCSEs exams cancelled, and he got teacher-based assessment scores. But that kind of, I think, opened the question. But the mental health element, emotionally based school non-attendance is on the increase. Children and young people are expressing greater incidence of unhappiness in school. This is Department for Education figures. And also today I was reading the Prince's Trust did some exploration around ambition and things like the cost of living crisis being shown as something that is dampening children and young people's ambition for achievement and attainment and jobs, which of course I imagine would affect their performance on something like a GCSE. So I am an educational psychologist, so I need to bring in some psychology. I haven't covered everything, so growth mindset kind of appeared in Bill's presentation. That was something that I should have really included, but that idea of kind of process being really important rather than an end point, which is very much what Carol Dweck would talk about. But I thought it would be helpful to think about three M's, just as a kind of starting point. And this is not really about assessment, because I think our assessment is a symptom potentially of the education system that we have. So as Anna Marie spoke about, children getting the education they deserve, and also thinking about what Bill was sort of highlighting, what is education actually for? And I think that is where our assessment comes in. It's tacked on to a wider system and a wider understanding of what education is all about. So is it all about knowledge, or is it all about skills, character, collaboration, creativity, resilience, emotional skills, social skills, problem solving, those really fundamental elements that are so important for young people when they get into adulthood, get into the workforce, and for our economy. So to inform the kind of education that would create some of those kind of really aspirational, successful young people and be inclusive for everybody potentially are some things, these are some things that psychologists would ask you to think about. So motivation, something that is really important to think about is self-determination theory. That idea that people are innately curious, innately want to learn. And you can understand that just by looking at any human baby who's going to be very curious, trying to do all sorts of different things, learning and adapting and absorbing the things around them. And that is something that Ryan and Decky, who produced self-determination theory and did lots and lots of research around that, says that will be maintained as long as there are three things that are available to those people. So autonomy, so being able to make choices, being able to kind of pursue the things that are important to you, relatedness, so having connections, not being in isolation, not doing that solo pursuit that Bill talked about, having opportunities for collaboration, and also feeling competent. And I think if you think about exams, you can't necessarily choose whatever GCSE you want to do. There'll be limited choices at your school. You have to do the core subjects. That's going to influence the autonomy. Relatedness, how many opportunities do you have to work with other people, to connect with other people during that learning, during the exams? And also, how competent do many of our children and young people feel? That sense of being set up for failure, that idea of potentially the one size fits all, perhaps not being appropriate, but perhaps setting children up for failing. And so that there's something about this system that psychologists would say kind of opposes what would be helpful for motivation, for engagement. And another really important element to that is going to be about the meaning. So that idea of actually, if we want children, young people to really engage in learning, to really engage in lifelong learning, and then see that as part of extension into the workplace, we need to have some kind of meaning that is personally meaningful for that person. And that will encourage and help their learning, but it was also a very key element of resilience and overall well-being, that sense of meaning for individuals. And finally, I think it's really important to think about mastery. So that idea of so Albert Bandura, another psychologist, thinking about self-efficacy, again, that idea of autonomy, that making choices, producing something, so that extended project qualification idea. This is something I have picked, something I have created and developed on my own, done my own research, developed the skills on my own, but with support, because there will be some kind of a supervisor involved in that extended project. But that sense of ownership, and I think that is something that's quite key in the Scandinavian education systems that was mentioned in terms of Finland and the PISA results. So those are three things potentially to think about. That idea of assessment can't be decoupled from the wider education system, and how do we make assessment better by making education better itself. So finally, I just want to finish with two young people's perspectives. So this first young person is somebody that Christina from the Special Educational Needs Consortium met with. And he spoke about his special educational needs around social, emotional, mental health, and the needs that he had for reasonable adjustments. But he didn't feel that he didn't have his reasonable adjustments provided for him. He had just finished his GCSEs, but hadn't had his results yet. But even so, he was feeling set up to fail, that he'd fallen through the cracks, and that he felt it was a real disadvantage for him because of the knowledge recall focus, rather than having that opportunity to present skills and to show that access to knowledge. How does he use the knowledge? Just having to kind of regurgitate all the knowledge. And he felt that his strengths were not reflected in the GCSEs that he had to choose. So there's no GCSE, for example, for advocacy. He said also that he didn't have any opportunity to talk about resets and having further options, that this isn't, there are second chances following a GCSE, which is, I think, would have increased his anxiety. And there's that sense of actually these core subjects, math, science, English, that is not really necessarily what I want to do for my career. And this young person found when he could have group discussions much more valuable in terms of learning, and I think potentially in terms of assessing what he got to know, what he knew. And this is a young person that I met as part of my educational psychology work. He was undergoing an education, health and care needs assessment. He was in year 11, he would have been just about to do GCSEs, but was not attending school because of emotionally based school non-attendance. He also had autism, so there were some kind of real challenges in terms of that neurodivergence and how he fit into school, how he could manage the school environment, manage the curriculum. But one of the things that he was really communicating to me, so firstly was, I've not been able to engage in this particularly narrow idea of education being all in groups, everyone learning the same thing, everybody going to the same groups and making lots of noise, and it being very sensorily overwhelming for me. But also that sense of, well, what I want to do, he wanted to work in a theme park, and he knew everything you could possibly imagine, including the high level physics of roller coasters. That's what he wanted to learn, and that's what he wanted to know. And there's no GCSE, no qualification for that. And he felt that, well, why should I engage in a system that is totally not fitted to me and what I want to do and what I want to be? And that sense of, I don't belong here. It's not for me. And that I think any reform around assessment needs to really understand young people's experiences, firstly, involve young people in finding out what this needs to look like, but also really thinking about how can young people, that individuality and that flair and the strengths, all those sorts of things, how can they be celebrated and acknowledged and understood in a really flexible way? And I think that will be quite a challenge, but really important, especially for the 21st century. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kath. That was also another really interesting, powerful presentation. I'm just thinking other things that you don't have a qualification in, as well as advocacy, or things like emotional intelligence and empathy, and a whole range of those sort of interpersonal skills that are so important as an adult and in the workplace. And that isn't just about regurgitating skills. And so, yeah, there's a lot of that we don't pick up just by, getting kids to sit in a dusty hall and take exams. Okay, questions. So I've got a few questions here that people have supplied in advance. So if I pose the first one and sort of point to who maybe might answer it, that doesn't mean you can't all answer it if you're desperate to, but I've sort of shared the questions around. So the first one is, do you think reforming secondary assessment at 16 would also require a review of the national curriculum, in particular for those who have no intention of continuing academic study but want to pursue their passions in trade or retail as entrepreneurs? Are our schools teaching them the right knowledge and skills at the moment? So I was thinking maybe this to Siobhan and Kath initially. Siobhan?
Okay, yeah, thank you, Sharon. Should we change the national curriculum, and is it serving our young people well? I think we've heard some really compelling evidence already that the answer is quite possibly no, in terms of teaching our young people the skills and key characteristics that would be valued worldwide among educational experts, but also in the workplace. But more crucially, I think that what we're teaching our young people at the moment is failing them in terms of the damage that it's doing to them and their lifelong learning, as Kath indicated. So at the BDA, we have a national helpline, and we receive over 5,000 calls a year. And broadly, those calls fall into two categories. One is from adults with dyslexia, and many of them report that they've been let down in their school experience. So we hear some really devastating stories, actually, from some adults for whom the education system has failed, and in particular the exam system, where they have felt like they've failed at education, and therefore that has impacted their entire life going forward, not just their work prospects, but also their emotional lives, their relationships and everything. And then the other kind of group of people that we tend to hear from our national helpline are parents and carers who are absolutely, what it boils down to is they are absolutely desperate to keep their young people engaged in education, either by ensuring that the schools are really working with them to give them the right support, or by trying to find out what can they be doing directly with those young people to keep them engaged. And we know that the statistics around young people and their absence from school are increasing. I think, as Bill mentioned, the most recent statistics of something like 28% of secondary school pupils are persistently absent, which is a huge number, and that's the representation among that number among children with special educational needs is much higher, and we're very much failing those young people in that case. Also, there's something like just about 800,000 children and young adults who are not in education, employment and training. And these are young people who have decided that school and that learning is not for them. And that will, again, impact them all the way through their lives, but also that has got associated costs with it, where by not supporting those young people in education and by providing the right sorts of assessment opportunities for them to really celebrate what they have achieved, they're disengaged. And the situation now is that you can have a young person, and we get calls relating to this on our helpline. You can have a young person who's been in school from the age of 4. They've done absolutely everything that's been asked of them. They've put in as much effort as they're able to, and they sit the exam, GCSE exam, and on that day, for whatever reason, the way the exam goes is that they get for example, a grade 3, which means that they have failed that exam, and then they've got absolutely nothing to show for those 11 years where they have been applying themselves in school. And worse, even if they did then get a grade 4 in their GCSE, the way that we currently measure the performance of a school doesn't recognise that. So if you have a child who's worked very, very hard to get their 4 in English and maths, which is brilliant, the school is measured on how many children are getting a grade 5. So the school doesn't get the benefit of demonstrating that, which is, as Anna-Marie said, a sort of perverse disincentive for those schools to really support those young people. So the short answer is yes. I would absolutely love to see a review of, you know, what children are taught in schools, but in particular how we assess them to include all learners.
Thank you, Siobhan. Kath, have you got some thoughts on that question?
I think just to really echo what Siobhan said, I think, you know, definitely yes. And the Association of Educational Psychologists particularly is calling for a review of education, the wider system, and the national curriculum. And I think to kind of support what Siobhan is saying, Anna-Marie was talking about special educational needs and the rising figures. And I suppose my question back is, perhaps there is an element of improved identification, but I also wonder, and this is a narrative that many SEC members have, is the system itself, because it is, you know, that sort of narrow middle of the bell curve type system, that it is very particular in terms of its focus as well, narrow academic knowledge-based focus. That failure of children and young people is the national curriculum creating special educational needs for a vast majority of those children who are now on the SEN registers in our schools. And I think that is a significant question, that if our national curriculum was much broader and much more inclusive, would special educational needs become a very different creature? That's my question.
That's a good point. Bill, looks like you want to come in.
Yeah, I'm in the same place as both of my colleagues here, but I think it's just conceptually worth asking two questions. One, what is the question to which GCSEs is the answer? It was an obvious good question when the school leaving age was 16. We needed some way of judging progress. At 16 now, in some areas like where I am in Hampshire, you do need something, because there's an 11 to 16 system, and it then splits off into sixth form colleges and colleges. So you do need something, but I'm not sure you quite need the something and the massive investment of time and money we put into that. The second question is it even possible to think of a curriculum that is not intimately connected with pedagogy and assessment? To which I'll offer the answer no. They go hand in glove. So you just can't. It's almost it's a question to which the answer is resoundingly yes. You can't change one bit of it without imagining you're going to have to change the other bit of it. So I would gently suggest that there's compelling international evidence that we're in the slow lane here.
Excellent, thank you, Bill. Right, second question. The Joint Council for Qualifications details access arrangements available to learners with SEND, i.e. reasonable adjustments. Are these sufficient to make a level playing field for learners with SEND sitting unseen, written, timed exams? Anna-Marie, come to you.
I don't think that they are sufficient, and that we need a far broader range of adjustments. So if we really were to consider much more broadly the range of reasonable adjustments that would need to be put in place, it would include environment, place. It would include the modality of the exam. So whether that is actually a written exam, whether that's supported by digital, or whether a learner has an opportunity to provide a spoken response. There's a whole range of different modes of assessment, and I'm not convinced that they really are routinely deployed across our mainstream sector, which is largely what I've been talking about here today. I have purposely not talked about specialist provision. You know, there's some examples of excellent practice where there is real personalisation, but the GCSE offer is not routinely available in the specialist sector. Of course, there's going to be exceptions to that, but I haven't talked about the personalisation that's often available there, and we could learn from. You know, we could incorporate some of the best practice within mainstream, and we could look much more broadly. I think there's also a point here, which is, of course, we're talking about assessment because that's why we've gathered today. But I mentioned earlier about the opportunity to maybe access whatever the assessment level is at different stages, so it's not all just on a chronological age. If all children and young people from the earliest years had a learner profile, then the learner profile would be about building success and recognising where they might need support with particular challenges. We don't always know that that's a SEND need until later on, when there's a failure. But at some points in their earlier years, we might well spot that they've got a particular pattern of engagement where they
just come in here.
Yes.
We've talked about more assessment. We're going on about the rate of progress.
Yeah.
We talk, because let's face it, the current system is based on the academy system, which was based on you passed or failed as an academy by the number of people who go through a GCSE. And that was the blunt system designed to get it through. And it was a coalition problem, and backbenchers couldn't do much to change it, he said, in personal defence. But at the moment they're talking about this, is there any form of reality coming out? Because it's a very mixed picture. Yes, we'll do something about it, we're going to get rid of certain things, and it's too expensive, etc. It's rather a mixed message at the beginning from the government. And anybody who comes in is going to have to deal with these series of policies running. I just wondered if you felt that there is any practical basis for actually working. Sorry, I was speaking of the debate. But you've got to come through this to say that that could be expanded to compensate for this.
Yeah.
Because it's being talked about, it's being motioned at, but I don't know how it bites.
And I think a really practical and pragmatic solution would be to broaden the range of assessments, and that also means progress measures all the way through school, but ultimately to broaden the option, to broaden that basket of what's available. And if we were to say we're not destabilising a system, we're going to do something without significant investment, we could do that quite simply by identifying alternative options of assessment. I would say it's a real strength in a world where we are looking at increasing education, health and care plans, which document a child's needs and how they're to be met. If all children had a learner profile, then for some that would be more detailed because they have additional needs, and for others it would be just the profile with the information that's required about them. We have a system in pre-reception in health, the Red Book system, which has been digitalised in some areas. So that's unites all children, whether they have an additional need, whether they have a SEND need that's known from birth.
Well, it wasn't so much about what you could do, it's what is the basis if the government are doing now that you think you actually could have made some intervention on. Because if we have to wait for new bits of legislation and to campaign for, it gets much more difficult.
I think including in broadening the range of assessment tools, and most certainly deploying information, ideas, requirements around reasonable adjustments for accessing a testing assessment system, and sharing the information, the tools that are practically working, so the approaches and so on. That could be done in a relatively straightforward way. It wouldn't require legislation change. Some schools are broadening their offer because they haven't stepped away from GCSEs. they've retained that, but they have other tools too. And I think sharing that routinely, encouraging schools to come from under the radar to say this works for us, would be very empowering and inclusive.
A couple of quick points I wanted to make before we try and squeeze in the last two questions, if that's possible. When you talk about the reasonable adjustments, as those of you who know me will know, my son's severely dyslexic, and he's 29 and in the RAF training to be an air traffic controller now. Although he doesn't get reasonable adjustments there, you either can do it or you can't, but that's fine. So in his exams, he had a reader and a scribe, and when it came to the English language, we had to fight for him to have the reader or both, because they sort of said he couldn't have that in the English language exam, which was ridiculous, because we're saying, well, you can have it in the others, and we're going, but we're measuring his English language, and I'm going, but he still needs the reasonable adjustments to even be able to take part in that. So anyway, he reached the threshold, whatever that was. But one point that I think it was Siobhan made, or no, it wasn't you, Anna Marie, about children not being able to excel in other subjects. That really spoke to me when you said that, because I found out after the fact, when it was way too late, that he'd only been entered for foundation level in all of his subjects. That was never discussed. It was never explained to me that there was. I thought all children had a chance of getting an A, or what it was then, A down to, you know, F. And so they kept talking about him. Oh, we think he'll definitely get a C in this. We think he'll get a C in that. And I went, well, but what about maths and science? He loves those. You know, could he not get a B, even an A in math? I went, oh no. So they took the decision to decide to cap him and his future and everything that would stem from it, which I'll come to in a second, on that decision that they took without any parental engagement to put him in foundation, that they decided, well, we wanted to make sure he didn't at least pass his exams for the school. You wanted to make sure for the school and for your records and your league tables that he would be a C and not maybe just, you know, be stretched too much and accidentally get a D. And I get that for him, but it was more for the school. But that meant there was no way. In the old days of GCSE, O-level and CSEs, you could have double entry. I was double entered for CSE in, I think it was history, and O-level.
Other exams as well. You could do. You end up taking about 4 different exams.
Yeah, so I definitely was double entry, and that cost the school. So I know at the time, it was an issue, and you know they wouldn't just double enter you for everything, but you know, if they thought you were that borderline, so at least you got the chance. And I remember in one, I got one of the ones I was double entered for, I actually got a B in the CSE one. So obviously the B was the better one in the O level. But that really spoke to me when you said that. Siobhan's point was, I've given you the Joseph example, the Emily example of sitting the 4-year-old who does everything right, starts school, goes all the way through, and then as a 16-year-old sitting that exam just has a bad day. That was my daughter, who is not special needs, bright as a button, is a maths teacher now, got a high first, 85% in a maths degree, but she, on that, this will haunt her and it'll help her with her students. She was expected 3 A's, maybe 2 A stars and an A. B wasn't talked about with her A levels. But what happened, she's doing her business A level and didn't check the back page. And the last question with 15 points was on the back page. She finished 15 minutes soon, went through, checked all of her questions. Just as they were about to, I think she said there was 30 seconds left. So this stopped her being able to appeal it or whatever, because just then as she turned it over, I think as she went to hand it in, she saw it on the back page, read it in an instant, wrote down 4 facts, and that meant she couldn't claim that she hadn't seen it. I mean, she honestly hadn't. It was literally as she picked it up. But she was 1 point off getting an A. So they did appeal it, because a teacher, nobody could believe it. They were going, "Oh my God, Emily, how could you do that?" She probably would have had an A star, but because she lost almost all of the 15 points, she ended up being a B. I mean, it didn't cost her a place. She got in, did maths and everything like that, and she did really well. But that is a prime example of how it all been everything you've done in your whole up to age 18 was she just forgot to turn the page, and that is so
Sure.
that could have cost her.
There seems to be, I mean, I don't know about people listening, but it's the thing about the fact the government have come down a bit hard on the November retake or early take. It always struck me as being a rather petty thing to do, because, you know, I know bright kids who are good at passing this took X number of exams early to get them out of the way, so they weren't under so much stress. Also, the fact that many schools like you can pass 15.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about I mean, I've never understood that, other than the fact that it's a nice, clear table. I don't know if any of the people listening are saying about the multiple attempts to pass these exams surely must take some of the pressure off. I don't know if there's any studies on that.
So they dropped the note, because I took my maths early. I was one of those clever maths kids. I took it early. So they
I don't
stopped
know,
that.
has anybody
They
got
dropped
any
that now.
points on that?
And also on the back page thing, Emily said, I don't know if this is right for those who deal with exams a lot, she'd never ever in all of her exams at 16, all of her mock papers, had a question on the back page. So she never thought to even look on the back page. So that is, for a really silly thing, almost like a trick, it felt that, you know, they shouldn't do. Because that was, you know, all our friends seemingly had spotted it when they just glanced, you know, but she didn't even think to look on the back page. So I mean, all of these things about taking it early and almost, you know, it felt like a trick. She said that they put a question on the back page. Anyway, on Dominic's question, anybody got an answer about the November?
Or opinion?
Oh, yeah.
So in our school in particular, we've stopped doing the early entries because it was typically the children that were quite able in that subject. So take maths for an example. What was happening was that they would sit it early in year 10, they'd get a 4 or a 5 and they'd think, fine, I don't need to do it anymore. But actually they were really capable of getting a 6, a 7, an 8 or a 9. So there was kind of an acceptance of, I've passed it, I don't need to do it anymore. And it wasn't really getting the best out of the pupils. So that's why we stopped doing it, because we wanted them to get the best results.
Has that been accentuated by the, you know, more minutiae marking scale?
No, I don't think so.
Well, I mean, there's, you know, if you've got a B, you know,
yeah,
as opposed to sort of, you've got to get a 9.
yeah.
So it wasn't being used by the children who had failed and needed to have a second
No,
chance.
it was for the more able children.
Yeah,
So kind of linking on to your points about sort of pushing the children with the SEN as well, because some of my kids do excel in maths and English, so we should be getting the best out of them rather than just sort of making them all do foundation papers, for example.
Yeah, that is so. Well, I've spoken about it so often here, because I just think it is a terrible, terrible thing to just sort of, for whatever reason, just assume that that's good enough for you. You know, if you get foundation
we should be
for
aspirational
all.
for all children.
And that
And
really
for
spoke to
the point, if that isn't doesn't require legislation change, it's a philosophical change.
It's like the culture of
It's
school.
absolutely, and saying it's not acceptable to cap learning and to cap education.
So we've basically got the message is as much flexibility as possible.
Yes.
If you've got this, before you make any, I don't know. I've got 2 people looking at me who aren't saying very much. I'm rather worried. I'm being totally disappointed.
Can I ask the last question, in case we get chucked out of the room, can I ask my third question? How can we assess non-attainment measures such as creativity, team working and problem solving skills? Are there good examples to draw on? I know, I think Kath mentioned this. So can we come to maybe Kath? Bill, I see your lights on.
Only because I've got to jump off in 37 seconds. So the answer is yes. PISA have done it. Australia is doing it. Canada is doing it. Singapore is doing it. states across the world are doing it? The answer is yes, absolutely. We've just completed a intervention study here for rethinking assessment with our colleagues over in Australia, the Australian Council for Educational Research. Yes, the question is, do we want to do it? And why should we do it? I hope I've made the argument, but the answer is absolutely yes. You need to resource teachers and school leaders to be able to do it.
Excellent.
And it's been a thrill being here, but I'm really sorry. I've got to jump off and go and do other things.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Kath, have you got a thought on that question?
I don't think I can add anything to what Bill has said. And I think, you know, kind of judging from his presentation, I think he would be the expert, as he kind of co-created the PISA test for creative thinking. So I think, you know, perhaps pick his brain further at another time.
Brilliant. And Anna-Marie, could we how could we assess non-attainment measures such as creativity, teamwork and problem solving skills?
Yeah, well, remember Bill talked about that learner profile, and I think it's brilliant to be able to build as one goes, you know, evidencing, you know, achievements and so on that are outside of the domain of exams. I think that's a brilliant way of doing it.
So, in summary, if we've got a chance to have this last question, if you had to pick one single compelling reason to reform assessment at 16, what would it be? Who wants to go first?
I'd say inclusion for all, equity and inclusion and fairness for all.
Yeah. Kath, one single reason for reform?
Well-being.
Yeah. Lord Allington?
Simplicity might be an answer there.
Yeah. Fairness would be mine as well. Fairness, Siobhan?
Well, I would also add, you know, the cost of the damage of our current system, the cost to individuals, but also the broader cost to society.
Yeah, that is so true. How do we know? How do you measure lost potential?
Oh yeah.
You know what someone might have become if they'd, you know, just had that support, had been identified sooner, got the right label, didn't get the naughty label. I mean, your educational psychologist, Kath, we all know of the children. My son was that, he was getting sort of, oh, well, you know, he's a bit of the class clown. He was never the naughty kid, but in time he would have become. He was 10 when he was met someone like yourself and was diagnosed dyslexic. I had, you know, if I knew then what I'd known now, I would have spotted the signs so much sooner. But we all know of the children who get that naughty label, and you know, our prisons are full. Our prisons and you know, youth offending centres are full of children who've been given the wrong label and weren't diagnosed and helped sooner. So the cost to society is massive, isn't it? Can I thank you all, everyone who joined and stayed with us online? We're just a couple of minutes over. But thank you all. Great presentations from everyone. Thank you to everyone in the room. Thank you, Siobhan and Anna-Marie, and everyone who came along, and Lord Addington, as always. Shame Tom had to leave. Hopefully we'll send him the presentation so he'll catch up. But thank you all for attending, and that's meeting closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.